All right.
Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Datesman, editor-in-chief of The Intellectualist and host of History of the Present, a long-form interview series co-produced by The Intellectualist in Lincoln Square. History of the Present examines the major inflection points reshaping our world in real time, including artificial intelligence, robotics, Ukraine, Taiwan, migration, climate change, and democratic erosion. Today, we're glad to have Professor Phillips Payson O'Brien, professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews and the author of War and Power: Who Wins Wars and Why. Professor O'Brien, thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Brian. Really pleased to be here, and hope the weather is better where you are than in Scotland.
I don't know if that's I don't know if that is if that's possible right now, because it's pretty hot here over in the United States, unfortunately. I want to begin with your book, Professor. What motivated you to write War and Power?
Well, what made me to write the book was that the general analysis of both these big concepts, what makes a state powerful and how powers interact in war, seemed to be getting worse. Which is a weird conundrum, because we have all these think tanks, all these universities, all these people studying war and power, and yet the analysis of what makes them tick seemed to be going in a retrograde direction. And I was originally motivated by the analysis of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
What was the invasion of Russia and Ukraine? We're talking about the February 24, 2022 invasion. Yeah. What lessons, Professor, have we learned? Have you learned? Maybe strategists globally have learned about this invasion and why it has failed. Because my understanding is that the Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin believed that he would annex or defeat Ukraine in something like 3 days, and obviously that didn't happen.
Well, he wasn't the only one who believed it. I mean, the issue we face is that almost everyone believed it outside of Ukraine. So that the US government believed it, the European governments believed it, the think tanks community believed it. So the overwhelming consensus of the analytical community was that Ukraine would be defeated in a few days and that Russia would win. And this was said by people with access to the best intelligence in the world. So General Mark Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, went to Capitol Hill in January and said basically Kyiv would fall in 3 days. So that was a real problem, that people didn't understand what they were looking at.
And, Professor, what were those assumptions you think were going into those calculations?
Well, to me, it made no sense. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because it was based on a weird idea of war, that war is quick and goes according to plan. Look, if there's one thing I can tell you about war as someone who studied it for my career, is it never goes according to plan. That wars tend to go off the rails, they tend to metastasize, they go down directions you don't think. But the idea that somehow they are won immediately in the opening stages very quickly and very efficiently is just, as a concept, wrong. It's a weird way to look at a war. But then it's doubly wrong when looking at the Russian military. Why was the Russian military thought to be so good? There was no evidence that it was actually a very efficient military. It had not fought a large combined arms warfare since the Second World War. It hadn't shown its ability to take on a large enemy and defeat it. It had dropped bombs in Syria, but then no one could fire back at it. So we had created this weird vision of the Russian military. And then why did we think Ukraine was so weak? What was this based on? That it just seemed to me a total failure of analysis.
And Professor, do you think that was because there was an assumption that mass, right? So Russia has a much larger population than Ukraine. That's been an ongoing issue throughout the war. Do you think that the fact that Russia could get all those bodies to the front line, was that, do you think, probably one of the primary reasons people believed that Kyiv would fold so quickly?
Well, actually, of course, the Russian army that invaded in 2022 is much smaller than the Russian army now in terms of the soldiers deployed. And the soldiers who went in the original invasion were just over 200,000.
Yeah.
So they didn't have masses of manpower to throw at the problem. I just think it was partly based on the fact that the Russians had been turned into the Red Army of the Second World War, this somehow, super powerful force that could crush things in front of it, when simply there was no evidence that the Russian army was that. And secondly, it was lazy Moscow-centric analysis, that we had built up the Russian army in the analytical community, maybe because the Pentagon wanted it built up or the think tanks wanted it to seem impressive. But we had this idea of a super powerful Russia had been created when actually none of the underlying factors that make a power strong were there. The Russian economy is not particularly strong. It's not particularly large. It's not a high-tech economy. There's a lot of corruption in the country. The demographics weren't great. The leadership was a sclerotic dictatorship. So you throw all those things together. These are normally red flags when it comes to war and power, and yet they were, in the case of Russia, completely disregarded.
Professor, for people who might not study this or might not know about this, what do you, just based on your studying, what is the character of Vladimir Putin? And I ask you that because he seems to have, and I'll say he has no respect for life. He has said, or my understanding is that he is basically willing to throw as many bodies at Ukraine as possible. What is Vladimir Putin's geostrategic ambition in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I'm not a Putin expert, so I want to be careful. But it seems to me what he's trying to create is the new imperial Russia, the new Soviet Union. He has a view of a Russian chauvinist and a sociopath, you might say, towards Ukraine. The Ukrainians don't really exist. They're sort of Russians who have partly been led astray, and he is going to take them back in and make them be full Russians again. That he doesn't acknowledge that they are a separate people with their own history, with their own identity. He seems happy to wipe Ukraine off the map. That was his original plan. So, it was imperialism. It was no different than the Tsar in the 19th century or Lenin and Stalin in the 1920s. It's trying to take over more land and more people.
And would you say that that Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, do you consider this part of a global? Are we in a global war right now, Professor?
I'm a little reluctant just because this is so focused on Putin and Russia taking Ukraine. So had they taken Ukraine, which they would have assumed, and then moved to the Baltics, then you might have globalized it. But interestingly, of course, Ukraine's partners have made sure not to fight for Ukraine, not to globalize it. So the Europeans have not sent troops into Ukraine, not had an air sort of quarantine over Ukraine. So I think calling it a global war is going too far. I don't see that. I see this as two powers at war getting help from outside powers, and that often is what happens. But say neither the United States nor China nor Western European states have crossed the threshold as to enter the fighting. Only North Korea has.
And what do you in terms of Ukraine survival since 2022? Is this a military story? Or is this a story about how society, politics, leadership, information space, and sort of this national resilience? What is the story here, if there is one?
Well, you have to start with the armed forces, because the armed forces are the thing that defended Ukraine in 2022 and destroyed the Russian original invasion. So it began by that. Now, why were the Ukrainian armed forces far more effective than people expected? And you could then start saying a host of reasons, one of which would be there was a stronger Ukrainian identity and a willingness to fight than many people outside of Ukraine understood. It was widely assumed that the Ukrainians would sort of shrug their shoulders and, maybe go into Russia, maybe not be wild about it, but deal with it. This was part and parcel of speaking in Washington. Oh, Eastern Ukraine, they're Russian speaking. What difference will it make to them seemed to be the attitude. And that underrating of Ukrainian identity was pretty widespread. That they just didn't think people cared enough about being Ukrainian. And we can say now people do care about being Ukrainian.
How has war changed? You hear a lot of reporting on how war has changed since Russia's 22 invasion of Ukraine. Can you make this clear to the audience how much conflict has changed, even in broad strokes, to be clear?
It's an interesting question, what we'd forgotten is that war is about mass. That the United States had spent 20 years fighting a counterinsurgency war, the war in Iran, war in Afghanistan, and people have forgot that really isn't normal war, that's the United States fighting a counterinsurgency war, and by the way, losing it, and doing it without full mobilization, in fact, while allowing its war industries to atrophy in some way. It really didn't spend a lot building up its war industries. What's happened in Ukraine and Russia is we see what happens when two states go into full-throated war. They're going to try and make everything they can to fight the war. Now, what that has meant is that the kinds of systems that both sides had in 2022, the more sort of heavy, traditional legacy systems, heavy tanks, heavy warships, have become increasingly vulnerable to much cheaper systems that can be made en masse. The drone being the famous one, but drone is almost anything you would say is an unpiloted vehicle, from an aerial one to a land vehicle to a sea drone. They're just basically something without a human being on board that can do the kinds of things that a human being would have been used to do before. And these now can be reproduced in massive numbers. So the old systems, which were actually not that much in number. We used to think 1,000 was a lot of something, or 2,000 or something. Well, Ukraine's going to make 7 million drones in 2026. And I think that's the difference, is we're seeing that that mass has a quality all its own, particularly if you can come up with effective systems to make in mass.
Why have drones proven so useful in this conflict? For instance, why? There have been drones. There's a lot of talk about drones since Afghanistan, right? And maybe these were different drones.
They're very different. Yeah, they're small. There's so many different drones. I think that's the important thing. When we talked about the drones in Afghanistan, we were talking about larger U.S. drones, sort of Reapers, Predators, these kind of things that would spend a lot of time flying gracefully over the air because no one could shoot them down and then find their targets. What we have here now is a huge range of different things, from advanced long-range drones to also very cheap short-range drones that are not much different than ones that you could buy from a civilian drone manufacturer if you wanted to, just adapted with a ordnance on them. Now, why the drone has been effective is it just can be super accurate because it has a camera. Mm-hmm. And it's adjustable. So what we can see is the drone goes up there and the person who's in control of the drone can see exactly what is there. So it's impossible for people to hide. This battlefield is as close to transparent as a battlefield can be. You can't hide if you're under the ground or you're in a building, but you can't hide out in the open. It's almost impossible to do. And that the drone has the camera, which allows the operator to see exactly what they want to attack, and then to swoop in and make sure that subject is killed. So it's quite grisly in one way, of course. When the Ukrainians say, we had 35,000 Russian casualties this month, they know it because they have a picture of almost everyone.
Yeah. And what is, in terms of Ukraine as a society, it had certain qualities that made it able to adapt fairly quickly to this conflict that Russia didn't. Can you speak to that a little, Professor?
Well, I think one was they basically were Ukrainian and wanted to fight for their freedom, and so that they had a strong identity and a willingness to commit to it. The other thing is that Ukraine had been engaged now in since 2014 in many ways fighting for its freedom, from the Maidan revolution to resisting when the Russians invaded the Donbass. So the Ukrainians had built up a real willingness to commit to this war. They weren't going to roll over and be steamrollered. And they had something they believed they were fighting for, that they were actually making a better European future. The younger Ukrainians are quite convinced that Ukraine's future is at the heart of Europe as a major European state. And they believe that is absolutely worth fighting for.
Can you speak to the cost structure of defending against drones? So recently there was a lot of discussion, somewhat quantitative, about how much it costs. It might cost X, which might be a multiple times what it costs to produce the drone. And if you were to do this at scale, it's not cost effective. Can you speak to that a little?
Let's start with the U.S. experience in fighting Iran, where the problem with not preparing for the cheaper drone came out. So the United States went into the war with Iran with amazingly effective anti-air systems, the THAADs, the Patriots. I mean, things that can identify a target and shoot it down with high precision, and it really useful if you want to take an expensive aircraft out. The problem with the THAAD and the Patriot is each one is over $1 million. You're talking massive amounts of money to shoot something down because they're very highly engineered, exquisite systems. But what the Iranians had were, yes, they had some ballistic missiles, but they also had these $30,000 each Shahed drones. And the Americans didn't have a system that is able to cake that down except for a really expensive one. And so that's where you might say the cheap mass has a huge difference. It doesn't matter if you have the world's best anti-air system, if it costs you $1 million to fire it, and it costs the other side $30,000 to fire that cheap drone, you will go bankrupt trying to defend against that. And so that's, I think, the cost benefit thing. And what the Ukrainians have been doing for the last few years is developing a very different set of defensive weapons that are much cheaper. They're basically anti-drone drones is what they're working on. And they cost sort of $3,000 to $5,000. And that then brings the cost benefit equation back to the defensive side.
And they're going to keep driving that cost down, most likely.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's the cost when they first brought the system online. But then once you refine production, you mass produce, the price goes down a lot. So that's why the Ukrainians are in many ways now being courted by states around the world who want these cheap drone interceptors because they don't have anything else that they can use.
Professor O'Brien, you mentioned the attack on Iran. I believe it began February 28th, 2026. How is that conflict, has that made, in your opinion, and again, the audience, a lot of Americans watch this, has this made the United States safer and more secure?
No, it's made the United States weaker and more unreliable. It was a ridiculous war. It was a war of choice. I think we have to start with that. This is not a war the United States had to have. There was no strategic reason to have this war. That it was a war that the U.S. government chose to have because it wanted it. From what we can tell, it wanted it for a bunch of strange reasons. The number one reason was that Trump thought he would have an easy victory. The president of the United States had been fooled by Venezuela, the Venezuela experience, into thinking he just needs to give the order and the U.S. military can do what he wants, and that they would obliterate the Iranian government, put in a new leadership, and he would be a great man and win a war and have a parade and maybe get his name on that arch he wants to build in Washington, D.C. But he had no idea what he was doing. And that became apparent. They actually had no victory strategy if they couldn't decapitate the regime and put a new one in place. They hadn't built up the right kinds of forces. They didn't understand the fundamentals of war. And that was why, actually, within a few weeks, the panic set in. So the price of oil skyrocketed. The Iranians did something that Trump did not think they were going to do. They shut the Strait of Hormuz, which basically took 20% of the world's oil supply out of the mix. The price of oil skyrocketed. Then the price of gas at the pump went up, and Trump began to panic. He's been trying to get out of this war since mid-March, really. I mean, I think there was an understanding that they were caught in a bind from not long afterwards. And the Iranians have the whip hand. So what it's done for, say, U.S. partners in the Gulf is it's made the U.S. look ridiculous and weak and untrustworthy. It makes them think the U.S. is not the sort of big, protective, powerful force that they always thought. And sadly, it's made the Iranians, probably given them a great strategic benefit because other states in the region know they have to deal with Iran. Yeah. So it's been a catastrophe for the U.S.
And also we gave them a weapon that's very easy for them. They just put one mine in the Strait of Hormuz, for instance, global insurance companies probably they're not going to insure, or the cost is prohibitive. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, the closing the Strait of Hormuz was something that the administration should have assumed Iran would do, but they didn't, and they didn't have a plan for it. But closing the Strait of Hormuz with cheap drones is easy. All you need to do is threaten to hit, as the Iranians have hit, oil tankers with drones, and that's a real big problem. Absolutely. And it's not so much that even if the U.S. shoots down a lot of them, all you need is one drone to get through, and then on insurance companies, as you say, will get worried. And it just could have been or should have been predicted, and yet it wasn't, and it makes the United States look idiotic.
Assuming, let's say, geopolitics is a zero-sum game, let's just say.
I don't believe that, by the way.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
Well, no, I mean, the United States, the great success of the United States for the last 75 years was it built up this amazing alliance system that wasn't zero-sum.
But let me just politely push back, Professor. The president of the United States is clearly, I mean, based on his public words,
he is, yes, but he's wrong.
Yeah,
he's weakening the United States because he believes in the zero-sum international relationship, but because he really doesn't know what and that's why by taking that outlook, he has put the United States in a terrible position.
Yeah, and so one of the things that's very striking, Professor O'Brien, is that he seems obsessed with the Western Hemisphere. He doesn't seem to understand that we project power globally. Can you maybe speak to that a little? He sort of, it kind of brings to mind some of the worst excesses of when the United States would, let's say, go to Latin America and interfere for commercial reasons, political reasons, sometimes both. We went to Venezuela, and we have the vice president. We have the president talking about extracting their fuel to enrich Americans, right? And sort of, how do you think that plays into American soft power globally?
I mean, it's a disaster for the United States. I mean, the hemispheric stuff is weird.
Yeah,
because it's not based about having friends in the hemisphere. It's based on dominating the hemisphere. So you actually insult the Canadians, you insult the Mexicans, you decapitate the leadership of Venezuela. So it's not about trying to make yourself a trusted leader of the Western Hemisphere. It's literally by trying to overwhelm the other states, question their very existence, as in the case of Canada, or threaten to invade, as in the case of Greenland. So it's based on this weird idea. It's also based, I think, on an idea that that Russia can dominate Europe, which is a very strange view and simply not based on reality. But Trump always overrates Putin. The problem is that domination leads to loss. Trying to dominate is what Russia tried to do in Ukraine. It's what ended European empires after the Second World War. So it's trying to go back to a failed model. Actually, what worked for the United States was a powerful alliance structure with allies that wanted to be in the alliance. And that is now something that might be gone forever.
How do you think U.S. allies, particularly in Europe, how do you think they apprise the president's statements towards Greenland, particularly discussing annexation? How has this undermined NATO?
What? I mean, I don't think NATO actually exists in a real way now, in the sense that Europeans understand the United States would not fight for them against Russia. But I think Greenland was. In the January Greenland crisis might have been the Rubicon. That really, for most of 2025, if you go back and look at 2025, Europeans were desperate to try and get Trump on side. They debased themselves. They flattered Trump. They did what he wanted. They humiliated themselves to try and appeal to Trump, to keep Trump committed to NATO, as if they believed by being nice to Trump, by letting Trump seem the big guy, that he would actually commit himself to NATO. That failed entirely, because then in January 2026, Trump comes close to threatening war with NATO, basically to attack Denmark, because Denmark is the owner of Greenland, and there were French and German troops in Greenland. And when the Europeans really saw in January 2026 that, oh, this is serious, nothing we've done has worked. The United States might indeed use military force against Greenland, which means it would kill European forces. They woke up, I would say, or they understood that they had been living in a dreamland. And from that point on, there has just been far less confidence in the United States, and there's been an awareness that Europeans really should not rely on the United States going forward.
How do you think President Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China what do you think his understanding of our attack on Iran vis-a-vis Taiwan? Do you think he feels strengthened to attack Iran, or
yeah, I mean, it's a great. I mean, there's a lot of things to break down. Again, I'm not a Xi Jinping expert or a China expert, but I can hypothesize based on what we have seen. I think on the one hand, the Chinese can look and know the United States, there's not much they can do now. The United States has wasted all these weapons fighting Iran. Its stockpiles are short in many of them. So the idea that the United States is going to fight a long war to defend Taiwan, and is, I think the Chinese understand there's a lot of bluff to that. In fact, it might be all bluff. And by the way, they understand Trump has been trying to appeal to them. So Trump has been actually quite critical of Taiwan and been trying to get close to President Xi Jinping, in many ways, allowing Xi Jinping to actually insult him, though he was too stupid to understand he was being insulted during the summit in China. So that has worked very much in Chinese favor, that the United States is not seen as a reliable ally that can fight in the Western Pacific. The thing, though, that there are two things going on here that make you restrained. One, the Chinese also, I think, understand that any invasion, if they tried to invade Taiwan, that would be a mess.
Yeah.
That that is not D-Day. They're not going to overwhelm the Taiwanese the way the British and the Americans overwhelmed the Germans. That actually that they would suffer mass casualties. China that would come into an environment with lots of drones. The Taiwanese are building lots of drones. They have lots of anti-ship missiles. So the chance of defeat in the invasion is very, very high. And that, I think, has given the Chinese some pause. What they are doing now is actually planning a more blockade. It seems to be planning a more of a blockade strategy. That they know that they're not going to invade, do a D-Day, so they're going to try and cut Taiwan off from the sea. And as Taiwan is an island and needs shipping to survive, they believe they would get their way. Though the other thing I hear from China experts who know far more than me, and I'll pass on the ones who understand this, the Chinese don't want to invade. They want to take Taiwan. They want Taiwan in some ways to come back in their mind. And they would love to see basically the start of a Hong Kong process. For China, the Hong Kong process has been a great success. So you establish one political connection and then you grow it. And soon, before you know it, Hong Kong is basically fully back in China. And I think in their view, that's what they'd like to do with Taiwan. They'd like to Hong Kong it.
And any invasion of Taiwan by China would be could lead to a very precariousness for the Chinese Communist Party, which is basically predicated its rule on stability and economic growth, right? So anything that would get in the way of that, I imagine that would probably, I think that would probably give them pause. Professor, what do you make of the fact, and I don't know if this is a direct quote, but that the president said, or I'm paraphrasing, that Taiwan is a bargaining chip.
Yep. He said U.S. military support for Taiwan is a bargaining chip.
Yeah.
And that's, so he has not approved that sale.
Yeah.
He had approved it, and then he suspended it because the Chinese asked, and it has not been approved as far as I know. So he is treating weapons to Taiwan as a bargaining chip.
And what do you think? How do you think the Chinese see that?
I think they understand that Trump isn't really committed to Taiwan, that Trump has no affection for democracies. He doesn't believe in defending democracies like Taiwan. He doesn't believe in any historical connections to friends and partners like Taiwan. So they understand that for Trump, Taiwan is simply something to be traded away if he can get a good deal. And the Chinese understand that about him.
And how would you say? Professor, you teach at a university in the United Kingdom. The relationship between both nations has historically been very strong. Under this second Trump presidency, it seems to have significantly declined. Can you speak to sort of U.S. reputation and, just in your experience in the United Kingdom, particularly among elites, political elites, and the nature? Where would you say the special relationship is now, if it still exists?
Well, actually, it's been interesting. In 2025, the British elites, as you might call them, or the foreign policy establishment, were desperate to try and stay close to the United States. I mean, for me, it was a perplexing year because I never thought Trump would ever do anything for Europeans and that Europeans were fooling themselves. But I'd go to events and in London, you'd hear, "Oh, don't give up on the United States. Oh, the special relationship is still there. Trump won't be so bad. That this is just a phase and we'll get through it." So there was a real attempt to pretend the change was not coming and that the United States would remain close to Britain. That has changed in 2026. Now, in fact, the British don't like to be quite as aggressive towards the United States as, say, Prime Minister Meloni in Italy was the other day. So the British are a bit more reluctant to do that. But I think they also know that the United States cannot be fully trusted. One thing that has led to a slightly toughing rhetoric is Trump is so unpopular amongst the British people, as opposed to the elites, that actually standing up to Trump does some political gain, does you some political good. And that's across Europe. That what Europeans realize is that Trump is toxic for many Europeans, and therefore standing up to him gets you benefits.
I know I know you're a professor. You focus on war and strategy, but also sort of part of maybe underlying some of this is government structure, right? Sure. And democracy, autocracy. In your sort of academic experience, what societies tend to be more resilient?
Well, I mean, the old rule of thumb was democracies, are slow to act and are often caught off guard. But then once they get fully committed, they can mobilize and stay in the fight longer than autocracies or dictatorships. And it's an interesting, one doesn't want to generalize from the Russo-Ukrainian war. But certainly Ukraine being a democracy has helped it remain adaptable. I think it's been more nimble than Russia, and it's allowed it to come up with, say, this new drone strategy, which is very effective. Russia has got a weird situation. On one hand, the Russians have taken massive casualties in a way that I didn't know that they would be able to be capable of taking 1.4 million casualties. We're talking World War I level casualties that the Russians have suffered. On the other hand, their fighting does tend to be, I would argue, hampered by the fact that they're led by a sclerotic dictator who's been in power for 25 years and believes he knows everything and is willing to sacrifice the population. So what we see partly fits the model, but partly doesn't.
How do you think, again, you're overseas, how do you think the perception of the United States has changed since the first Trump term, let's say from January 2017, we're now in 2026?
Well, basically, actually, it's twofold. If you were America's traditional friends and allies, it's gone down. So Trump's view in Europeans is, I think, far more skeptical. View in places like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan are not positive towards Trump, because he seems to be a threat to their security and a threat to their way of doing business. However, he's popular in Russia. So different states, popular in China, perhaps, I don't know. But it's not the case that everyone around the world hates them, but just happens to be that if you were a good friend of the United States, he's been particularly harsh to you. And those people have really, I think, understood what he is and have a negative view of him because of that.
And where do you, in terms of U.S. democracy, as someone who looks at political systems, I mean, what would you say that our current system is under stress at the moment?
Oh, I mean, it's crumbling, and I don't know how you put it together again or create a new one unless you can get corruption out of it. I mean, the thing that most worries me is the level of corruption has entered the White House in historic ways. The United States has never been so corrupt. Look, it's had corruption issues in the past, but right now the president is taking billions of dollars a year in corrupt practices. The president's family.
And how does corruption undermine democracy?
Well, because basically the U.S. government's for sale. Mm-hmm. That it's not that the government is serving the national interest of the American people. It's the government is basically up for whoever wants to give the Trumps as much money as possible. That New York Times story this weekend was shocking. Basically, the Trump set up a mining deal with the Kazakhs to benefit his sons. And that's not in the U.S. national interest. That's in the Trump family interest. And once you make government corrupt like that, it's very hard to go back because successors will have an incentive now. I mean, why won't they make billions and billions and billions if we now know it's completely tolerated, that it's not, not going to get you in trouble and you can just go collect all this money? So I think that's the kind of thing that's going to have to be nipped in the bud first. There's going to have to be a real attempt to stamp out corruption at the top.
Do you have any opinions on the collapse of the GOP, the Republican Party?
Well, I would be very reluctant to say it's going to collapse. I think people are getting too confident in a way that they still poll 40% of the plus of the vote. They still have real reservoirs.
I meant moral collapse, not necessarily.
Oh yeah, I mean it's entirely disappeared. The thing that's really the stunning thing to me is how weak conservatism was as a philosophy in the GOP. I mean, I grew up in a generation where you took ideas seriously. You actually said people had ideologies. I was right wing. I was left wing. I'm a conservative. I'm a liberal, and a conservative has a set of principles going, Hayek or Hamilton or Burke or Buckley, and that they had these supposedly core beliefs on the size of the state and things like that. And actually, what we can see is none of it was true. They just do whatever Trump wants. So, the Republican Party has gone from being a party that said it had an ideology and said it had ideas and beliefs to simply a vehicle to do whatever crazy thing Donald Trump gets in his head. So they can be right wing on one issue, left wing on another issue, or they can be both, in short period if Trump changes his mind. So it's shown, I think, the Republican Party was a hollow reed when it came to ideology, and it was simply a vehicle to take power.
What is the future of warfare? There's a lot of talk about space warfare, knocking out satellites, things like that. What do you consider? What would you consider the future of warfare in the next 25 years?
Well, I mean, it will be. There will be a lot of attempt to shut down space connections because what we've seen in this war is communications. That reliable communications are incredibly important, and that has been something we've seen through Starlink and different elements like that. You want to have fast, efficient internet communications to the front line. If you lose those, that is a big loss. So there are going to be certainly ways to try and shut that down. There will be issues with blowing up satellites. If one side does it, the other side does it, and then everyone's satellites are gone and space becomes a nightmare, basically a garbage dump with all of these bits. So there's probably going to be a bit of incentive not to do that or not to cross that Rubicon, but that's not to say that it won't. But when it comes to war, what we see on Earth, I think the lesson we've learned is that if you can't make things in mass and you rely on just a small number of highly engineered, exquisite systems made in peacetime that you can't replicate, you're going to be in trouble.
Do you look at AI as a threat multiplier?
And well, I mean, I look at AI in many ways as unstoppable. And it's more like machine learning or autonomous systems it seems to be changing many things. Now, by the way, the original performance of it is mixed. So the United States said it used a lot of AI in targeting against Iran. And now if that's true, it didn't use it wildly effectively, I would say, and made some mistakes. But AI seems to be going, or autonomous systems seem to be appearing in a number of different areas. I use the phrase macro and micro to talk about the different areas. So there's the macro processing, which is autonomous systems or AI are taking all this data being fed into it about the other side and trying to pick targets from that. This is what you attack, this is what you don't attack. And so that AI is being used to analyze the enemy through inputs. And then when it comes to weaponry, AI is being used usually to improve survivability and accuracy. And more systems are being automated so that the Ukrainians have one now, an anti-air system that basically, you send it up and it has a target. And then from that point on, it just does whatever it has to do to get that to target. It's flying itself to get there. And
I was going to say, though, I mean, how, in terms of the information space, particularly the ability to just get out lots of propaganda, undermine populations, how does AI factor into that?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing, the Russians were very effective about it before AI. So I know that in fighting information warfare, which, by the way, I didn't understand the power of it. I tended to think people overrated propaganda, the impact on propaganda, because looking at it from 20th century wars, propaganda didn't make a massive amount of difference in a lot of cases. But what we've seen now is that certainly that you have the ability to get to the population and break it up into different elements and make it more conspiratorial, make it more suspicious, make it more divided. And that has been a great success of Russians in information warfare, not just in the United States, but across Europe. So that there have been a lot of these populist parties that are basically doing Putin's bidding and they're coming to power. So it's been, and as it has with the United States. So it is shown to be very effective, but I'm not sure that's AI because that was going on before AI.
Well, yeah. And I guess AI allows you to produce at even a greater scale. I would argue, possibly. In terms of, in terms of the United States, in terms of its military position, there have been talks about having a $1.5 trillion defense budget.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
That's insanity. Not because the United States doesn't need to rebuild its industrial base, but if you're going to give this corrupt Pentagon and this corrupt government an extra $500 billion, it'll be wasted and make things worse. Just spending money doesn't make you strong. You have to spend it efficiently. You have to spend it wisely. You have to spend it on the right technology, and you can't be corrupt. And by giving the most corrupt administration in the history of the United States an extra $500 billion, what you're going to do is waste that money and make things worse. So the last thing I would do if you want to make America stronger is give this Pentagon more money. I'd give it less and wait till that the United States has better leadership.
How would you evaluate the performance of, I'm going to say Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth? He likes being called the Secretary of War. How would you evaluate his performance?
He's Secretary of Defense. Secretary of War was actually an original position for the person in charge of the Army. Under the original government, but it was in the Defense Department Act. It was called Secretary of Defense. I don't know. He's a joke, and he seems to be cosplaying Rambo kind of thing, and going around working out with the soldiers, talking about being hyper masculine and all this kind of stuff. But that's not what wins wars. It actually loses wars, as we've seen, because he's lost a war with incredible speed against Iran. So he's out of his depth. He's a media personality that Trump liked him on TV. And the United States is paying the penalty for being led by such a shallow figure.
How do you think his counterparts overseas, for instance, view Hegseth?
Well, they haven't told me, but I can't believe it's terribly positive. They have to be nice to him and to his face, but Europeans have to look at this guy who basically comes and insults them and then says we're pulling our troops out. They have to look at him and go, we know what you are. And so I don't believe a lot of people view him as a formidable figure. They view him as a bit of a blowhard, but he's a blowhard in charge of the U.S. Pentagon, and that makes him a very, very dangerous blowhard.
Professor, what are you working on now that might interest people? I know you have a Substack. I know you do quite a bit of writing, and you do engage the public quite a bit in these sorts of interviews. What are you working on that maybe people can learn about?
Well, I mean, I'm finishing a piece on the history of Ukraine as part of the Ukraine History Global Initiative this summer. So that's my job this summer, which has been a lot of fun to do, and it's quite rewarding work. My next book will be a history of military logistics, strategic logistics, going back to classical period to today. So it will be talking about what logistics is and how logistics actually determine wars, not battles, but by using some of the most famous wars that you think you know about and reframing them as logistical struggles. Things like the First and Second Punic Wars, or the Crusades, or things like that, and taking these historic events and saying, look at them this way, and you'll understand why they worked out the way they did.
We try to, because we cover some very heavy stuff at History of the Present, we do try to end on an optimistic note if it's possible. And if there's anything you think maybe we can leave the audience with about something that might make you feel a bit optimistic or hopeful, even if it's right now kind of hard, what would you say to the people watching this?
Well, the United States being so dangerous and unpredictable has actually motivated other states to start doing more in their own interest. So Europeans are doing more, which is probably a good thing. Certain South American states are doing more. Canada is doing more. Japan's doing more. So the United States being an unreliable friend and a dangerous friend, and maybe not a friend anymore, has been terrible for the United States, and it's weakened the United States. But it has actually gotten states that matter to stand up and start doing more, and that's not a bad thing.
Well, Professor O'Brien, it was a real pleasure having you on History of the Present. We'd love to have you back to discuss what you're working on, particularly with Ukraine, logistics, and hope you have a great day.
Great. Glad to have done it. It was a lot of fun. Take care, Brian.
Thank you.